When God rebuilds you, He rarely does it in front of anyone. He does it in silence, in the seasons nobody is watching, in the rooms nobody else walks into, in the years that don't make it into the story you eventually tell other people about how you healed. Most people picture rebuilding as something visible, a dramatic turning point, a clear before and after, a moment everyone around you can point to and say, "That's when things changed." But real rebuilding rarely works that way. It happens in fragments, in ordinary days, in a silence so complete that it's easy to mistake it for nothing happening at all. Isaiah 58:12 describes it directly. "Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings." Notice what's being rebuilt in that verse: ancient ruins, age-old foundations. Not fresh damage. Old, long-standing wreckage that had been sitting there so long, people had stopped expecting it to ever be repaired. Here's what's actually at stake if you only trust rebuilding you can see happening. You assume that because nothing dramatic is occurring, nothing is being restored. You measure healing by spectacle instead of by substance. And when your own healing doesn't look like a spectacle, you conclude it isn't real, or isn't happening fast enough, or isn't happening at all. That conclusion costs you the ability to recognize the quiet, unglamorous version of restoration that's actually available to you. The only version, in fact, that most real healing ever takes. Think about the story of Nehemiah for a moment, because it's one of the clearest biblical pictures of rebuilding that actually happened. When Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, the wall around the city had been broken down for so long that it had become the norm. People had simply adjusted to living in a ruined, exposed place, because the ruin had been there so long it no longer registered as unusual. Rebuilding it wasn't dramatic in the way we imagine drama. It was brick by brick, section by section, done largely in obscurity, without applause, often under real opposition from people who preferred the ruins to stay ruined. Nehemiah 6:15-16 records something remarkable about how that project ended. The wall was completed in 52 days, and when the surrounding nations heard about it, they were afraid and lost their confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Notice the order of that verse. The rebuilding happened first, quiet, methodical, unglamorous. The recognition came after, and it came from people who hadn't even been rooting for the project to succeed. The visible proof arrived only once the invisible work was already finished. This matters because it means the recognition you might be waiting for, other people finally seeing that you've healed, that you've changed, that something real happened in you during this quiet season, was never meant to arrive first. It arrives after, sometimes long after, once the actual rebuilding has already been completed in a place no one else had access to. Waiting for recognition before you believe the rebuilding is real gets the order backward. Let's talk about what this rebuilding actually looks like day to day, because the abstract version is easy to nod along with and much harder to recognize while you're living inside it. It looks like a wound that used to control your entire mood, now sitting quietly in the background of an otherwise normal day. It looks like a trigger that used to derail you completely, now registering as discomfort instead of collapse. It looks like being able to think about what happened to you without the thought consuming the next 6 hours the way it once did. None of that shows up as a headline. It shows up as the slow, boring accumulation of ordinary days where the damage simply takes up less space than it used to. It also looks like changes in what you no longer tolerate, even before you consciously decide to raise your standards. Conversations that once would have kept your attention for hours start feeling draining faster than they used to. Situations you would have stayed in out of habit start prompting an internal alarm you didn't have before. That shift isn't coldness settling in. It's often a sign that the part of you responsible for self-protection has been repaired enough to actually function again, after however long it spent too depleted to notice warning signs at all. Zechariah 4:6 gives language to how this kind of rebuilding actually happens. "Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty." That verse was spoken specifically to someone facing a rebuilding project that looked impossible by ordinary means, and the promise wasn't that ordinary means would suddenly become sufficient. It was that the project would succeed through something other than visible strength or dramatic effort. Some of the most important rebuilding in your life is not going to look like willpower or striving. It's going to look like something quieter working underneath your own effort, often in ways you can't point to directly, even while looking back at the result. This is where it helps to understand what silence is actually doing during a rebuilding season, instead of just enduring it as an absence. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." That instruction is usually read as a comfort verse, and it is one, but it's also a description of a specific posture required for a specific kind of knowing. Stillness isn't the opposite of rebuilding. In this context, it's the condition rebuilding requires. A wall can't be examined honestly, foundation to foundation, while everything around it is still in motion and noise. The silence you're in might not be empty space around the rebuilding. It might be the exact quiet the rebuilding needs in order to happen thoroughly instead of superficially. Think about what it would mean to rebuild something important while surrounded by constant noise, constant distraction, constant performance for an audience. Quick patches get applied instead of real repair because there's no space to slow down and actually assess what's broken beneath the surface. Silence removes that pressure. It's uncomfortable, often lonely, frequently mistaken for abandonment, but it creates exactly the kind of unobserved space where real structural repair becomes possible instead of just cosmetic covering. Here's something worth sitting with honestly. Rebuilding in silence often means going through it without anyone fully understanding what you're going through in real time. People might see you differently before and after, but very few people get to witness the actual process in between, the specific days that were hardest, the specific moments where you almost gave up on the rebuilding altogether and settled for staying in the ruins instead. That aloneness inside the process is one of the harder parts to accept, because human beings generally want to be seen, especially during difficult seasons. But being unseen during the hardest part of the rebuilding doesn't mean the rebuilding isn't real or isn't mattering. It might simply mean this particular kind of repair was never meant to have witnesses at every stage. Psalm 51:10 captures the specific nature of what's actually being rebuilt in a season like this. "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." Notice the two things named there, a pure heart and a steadfast spirit. Not circumstances, not other people's opinions, not even outward success. The rebuilding described in that verse is internal architecture, the part of you that holds everything else together, the part that determines how you'll respond to whatever comes next, long after this current silent season has ended. This internal rebuilding is often what makes external rebuilding possible later. A wall built on ground that was never properly repaired underneath will eventually show the same cracks it had before, no matter how good the new stones look on the surface. The quiet work happening in you right now, the part nobody can see, the part that doesn't look like progress because it's happening underground, in the architecture rather than the decoration, might be exactly the layer that determines whether whatever you eventually build again actually holds this time. It helps to think about what actually gets repaired first in a season like this, because it's rarely the part people notice last. Usually, the earliest repair is the quietest one, something in how you talk to yourself when no one else can hear it. The tone shifts before the circumstances do. A voice that used to default to self-blame starts, slowly and inconsistently at first, offering something closer to patience instead. That shift doesn't announce itself, it just starts showing up more often than it used to, until one day you notice the harsher voice hasn't spoken in a while, without being able to point to the exact day it went quiet. It's worth naming a common misunderstanding here, because it's easy to slide into it without noticing. Silence during rebuilding is not the same thing as isolation you're choosing out of fear. There's a difference between a season that's quiet because deep repair requires quiet, and a season that's quiet because you've withdrawn from anyone who could actually help you, out of shame or exhaustion, or a belief that you don't deserve support while you're still broken. The first kind of silence is productive, even when it's hard. The second kind can quietly work against the very rebuilding it seems to be protecting. If you're not sure which one you're in, a fair question to ask is whether the silence still has room for at least one trusted person, even if that person doesn't get to see everything, or whether the silence has become total, cutting off every possible source of support along with the noise you were trying to escape. There's a version of this that's worth naming specifically because it's common and rarely discussed. Rebuilding while still performing wellness for everyone around you. Showing up to work, to family gatherings, to ordinary conversations, wearing a version of yourself that looks finished while the actual rebuilding is still very much in progress underneath. That performance isn't necessarily dishonest. Sometimes it's simply what functioning requires while the real work happens elsewhere, out of view. But it's worth checking in with yourself honestly about whether the performance has become a substitute for the rebuilding rather than a container around it. Whether you've started believing your own performance instead of remembering it's separate from the quieter, truer process still happening underneath. Think about what you've actually rebuilt so far, even in pieces, even without full completion. Maybe it's trust, not blind trust in everyone, but a working capacity to let people close again after something taught you not to. Maybe it's your relationship with rest, learning to stop treating exhaustion as a badge of honor. Maybe it's simply your ability to sit with a hard day without spiraling into the belief that every hard day proves nothing has changed. None of these show up as a finished wall you can point to and declare complete. They show up as small sections, laid one at a time, in an order that only makes sense once you step back far enough to see the whole structure taking shape. It's also worth being honest about how uneven this process usually feels while it's happening. Rebuilding rarely moves in a straight line. There are weeks that feel like real progress, followed by days that feel like everything that was repaired has quietly come undone again. That unevenness isn't proof the rebuilding failed. Nehemiah's own account of the wall includes constant interruption, opposition, threats, exhaustion among the workers, days where the project seemed genuinely at risk of stopping altogether. The 52 days it took to finish weren't 52 days of smooth, uninterrupted progress. They were 52 days that included real setbacks, absorbed and worked through without the project being abandoned. That's closer to what your own rebuilding probably looks like too, even if it doesn't match the version of healing you originally pictured. If you're in a season right now that feels like nothing but silence, no applause, no witnesses, no clear proof that anything is actually being rebuilt, consider that this might be exactly what real repair looks like while it's still underway. Nehemiah's wall wasn't recognized as the work of God until it was already finished. The recognition was never the proof. The finished wall was the proof, and the recognition simply followed once there was something visible left to recognize. So ask yourself honestly, is there evidence, even small, even easy to overlook, that something in you has been repaired that used to be broken? Not proof loud enough for anyone else to notice yet, just proof true enough for you to notice, if you're willing to look for it, instead of waiting for someone else to point it out first. If this spoke to where you are right now, stay. There's more waiting for you here. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, because what's being rebuilt in you right now doesn't need an audience to be real. It just needs time.